Greetings, everyone. Good morning. I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. Thanks for us for an uncharacteristically early morning meeting. U.S. China relations are important to talk about at any time of the day, and this is the time that we were able to work out with our very distinguished speaker, a very great friend, Frank Lavin, who many of you know was our ambassador to Singapore during the Bush administration. He was Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. He's an old friend of mine. I'm on his Frank Lavin annual sort of holiday New Year's note, and I've been following Frank's career, life, and interests for a very, very long time, I think since I worked for Senator Jeff Bingaman in the 1990s, and then went on to the Economic Strategy Institute. And what we're here to talk about today is U.S. China policy during the Obama administration and where that's going. And I think it's timely and important. On the front page of the Financial Times today, there's actually a little bit of discussion about a new Buy Chinese edict set to cause unease for Beijing trade partners. And there is this interesting question of, during a financial crisis, when everyone's sort of looking at their own job base and they're looking at how to, you get to the whole question of what norms matter in the international economic system, what ought to sort of guide America's own strategic direction in thinking about jobs, investment, innovation, and how the global economy works, and also taking a read of how our other major trading partners look at these same kinds of things. And I can think of no one better to help provoke a good discussion than Ambassador Frank Lavin. So without further ado, please welcome Ambassador Franklin Lavin, and then we'll have a great discussion afterward. Frank, thanks for being here this morning.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. That was a very, very gracious introduction. Thank you, Ben Karcher here. Ben helped organize this. Thank you, Ben, for pointing
Ben did everything.
Ben did everything, but Steve got the applause. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for coming out and giving a little time on this topic. I just want to have a general discussion. Be delighted to go into questions. And I think we have to say up front that my purpose is not to provide an evaluation of the subject matter for the fundamental reasons that it's pretty early in the game, and I don't think that's fair to any participant to say, here's where we stand, although I would also add in the same breath, look, so far so good, and I'll get into that. And secondly, look, a lot of foreign policy initiatives and tactics are not just subjective in themselves, but the ultimate impact or ultimate value or wisdom can take some time to fully materialize. So it'd be a little bit presumptuous to say, well, what happened last week seems not to have worked, or what happened 2 weeks ago really seems to have been brilliant. But nonetheless, even in 130, 140 days of a presidency, I think there's some indicators out there and some general statements that can be made. And I think I want to just confine my remarks to three sort of areas. One is our starting point, or if you will, so far, the last 4 months, what we've seen and how to assess that. Second area I want to get into is potential issues or trouble spots. And third, I want to pick up where the topic that Steve introduced about the impact of the recent global economic turmoil and contraction, and what impact that has on policy decision makers. Thanks, Ben. Ben, I just gave you a shout out while you were.
Ben does everything.
Brings the water. That's good.
He didn't take care of the creaky floor.
Exactly. Good. Well, look, on the first point, where are we starting? What have we seen over the last few months? What kind of a bilateral relationship did Obama and his team inherit? And that's why I said, so far so good. Actually, there's a high degree of stability in the bilateral relationship. I think it begins on a pretty positive footing. There's no crisis, there's no burning issue, there's no emergency, there's no immediate friction point. There are a range of issues, and we'll talk about them. But I think most people would say it begins on an even footing, and President Obama has done, vis-a-vis China, he has taken the same approach that all of his predecessors have taken from both political parties since the beginning of modern relationships, since the first Kissinger-Nixon trips now 35 plus years ago, which is to say, let's take this on a mature footing and a professional footing. Let's make a serious senior level commitment to have a productive, positive relationship, even though there are differences. And I think we see very much that same impetus from the Obama administration, meaning he's not looking for to focus on differences, and Chinese leadership is not looking that way either. So there's a leadership commitment, I think, for positive relationship, and it's consistent with recent decades of U.S. foreign policy. That's my starting point. Let me add to that. There's also, I would say, a very strong Asia team. in the Obama administration. And I start with Secretary of State, who I think has got the right instincts, the right personal commitment, and I say this as a lifelong Republican, but also Kurt Campbell at state, Jeff Bader, the defense team. I mean, these are people who have literally decades of grounding and orientation in China and Asia issues and are well on top of their portfolio. So it's a solid Asia team. The other point I'd make that I think is worth noting up front is that one of the issues that occasionally has festered and occasionally threatened to impinge on the more central bilateral relationship in recent years has been cross-straits relationship. And I'd say cross-straits relationship are on a positive footing now as well. And we know at times in the past decade there are various sort of policy tacks taken by leadership in Taipei, which again threatened to sort of roil the waters. And Beijing was uncomfortable. The U.S. at times was uncomfortable, and those issues are in abeyance. So it's a positive moment. Secretary of State, I think, had a successful trip. Secretary of Treasury had a successful trip. We have the SAED coming up, presumably next month. So the normal opening activity for a new administration, I think, is unfolding in a professional and positive manner. Diplomatic connectivity, introductions, defining roles and responsibilities, and looking for the mechanisms that allow us to get into solving problems and addressing policy issues. So off to the right foot. That's sort of the good news, if you will. I don't think there's necessarily bad news, so to speak, but there are problems and issues out there that we ought to be aware of. And if you say, well, what could go wrong? What challenges are there this year? Well, there are a few that we ought to be mindful of. One, and I'll talk more about this as my final mark. This is just a general point on trade friction. Not particular to the economic downturn, but probably exacerbated by it. But the point is there is ongoing trade issues, trade disputes between U.S. and China. And one of the elements of the new U.S. president is that he has got constituencies on his side that are very sensitive to these trade issues and I think are going to try to push. And indeed, we already had a 421 suit filed by United Rubber Workers as a good example of this is a growing Chinese export. It's not a huge percentage of Chinese exports, but we've not had a successful response to 421 suit in the U.S., so it'd be a little bit out of character if this were successful. But you don't know. It's a new team. There's a new political dynamic, and we don't have an indication of what the Obama administration will do. So trade friction, I think, will bubble up a bit, and there's going to be nationalism or protectionism in both countries. But we're going to see, I think, more of an appetite for trade rules, trade remedies, anti-dumping, countervailing duty initiatives. So that's one set of issues. A second set of issues is what you might call generically third country issues, which might mean more prominently North Korea. How are these two countries going to collaborate on North Korea, but could also relate to Iran potentially or other kind of third country initiatives. By the way, I always tell my friends when we start talking about how can the U.S. and China work together on third country issues, which is a good area to explore, I always say, there's an implicit complement in that question. Because the implicit complement in that question about third countries issues is it's a way of saying that there's no burning bilateral issue. If what we're saying, how are Beijing and Washington going to really get along vis-a-vis North Korea, that's a good topic. But what we're really saying is there's nothing critically amiss in the pure bilateral relationship. But look, not approaching North Korea the right way could have broader consequences that we should all be mindful of. So it's not a minor issue just because it's a third country issue. Another issue which bubbled up earlier this year, and it's unclear where it's going to go, were the two incidents of harassment of U.S. Navy vessels in the South China Sea. And this was a little bit surprising to China watchers and China hands because I think most would describe Chinese foreign policy in recent years as part of a charm offensive, that they had not sought conflict, that they were focusing on domestic issues, and in any event, since they were in economic ascendancy, that it wasn't in their own foreign policy interest to force any issues as long as the trajectory was positive. So it was a little bit of surprising, I think, to China watchers when those incidents came up. Unfortunately, they also came about when there were news reports on two incidents alleged incidents, maybe I should say, of cyber warfare. One, this Toronto study on hackers globally in cyber space that systematic efforts originating in China. And secondly, there was a report on penetration of U.S. electrical grid. And those reports all came around the same time, which is a bit unfortunate because if you read into it, some of these incidents took place over previous years and simply came to the surface. Nonetheless, it's going to raise questions, and I think it tells you that although the bilateral relationship is improving, there's always the potential for downside movement, and that's certainly one area. Another area that we're going to see as a potential issue this year is climate change, where the U.S. and China simply have a different view on this. But with the Copenhagen summit coming up, U.S. will be, I think, increasingly interested in sort of inducing China to perform in a way it wants to see. It was noteworthy in this regard as when the Speaker of the House visited China 2 weeks ago. I think the top three issues she dealt with Chinese leadership was climate change, climate change, climate change. I mean, it's a very strong focus of the U.S. Government. The State Department has a special advisor to the Secretary on environmental issues who goes with the Secretary to China. China itself, I think, just has a different view of the issue and has a limited appetite for sort of subscribing to the U.S. approach on this. So that's a potential area of difference as well that will manifest itself this year. Finally, let me touch on the turmoil and the point Steve alluded to in the opening remarks. I think we're seeing a bit of a policy change in the U.S. and in China, maybe more so in China than here, as a result of the economic contraction and the financial turmoil. And it's somewhat similar in both countries, but again, I think maybe a bit more pronounced in China. And that's the intrinsic attractiveness of the Western model, so to speak, has been called into question. And the argument for a greater state role in the economy is more in favor. And look, none of this is in surprise on the heels of this kind of economic performance. You'd be surprised if this isn't what happened. I think the challenge, though, in China, maybe to some extent in the U.S., are people who are philosophically predisposed in this direction, in any event, simply using this as an excuse. And I think in China, there are always folks who are sort of more market-oriented and more skeptical of markets, and it's just going to tilt discussions in that direction. That probably also means more trade friction from China's point of view, as Steve pointed out, by China initiatives, more of an appetite for China developing its own standards, for example, in telecom, which we see them well on that path. Just less of an appetite for this sort of, the world is flat view to say to be a successful society, we've got to look to open trade flows, open capital flows, globally accepted standards, and so forth. I think you'd say that was a dominant Western philosophy pre-turmoil. I think it's still dominant, but less so. But in China, it's always a little bit more open to debate and discussion as to the appeal of market economics and the role of the state. And I think what we see now is a go slow movement from Chinese leadership, and in some respects even some retrogression, where they're saying, we want to be thoughtful about what's the proper role of a stock market in a country. Does it help the economy, or is it merely a speculative vehicle that can hurt people and cost them their savings? I mean, well, I think you could say conceivably it could be either one. It depends how it's regulated. But if you have a well-regulated stock market, then businesses have access to capital and they can expand, and that does contribute to prosperity. And you can also get stock market bubbles and speculation, and like any financial transaction, there's always the possibility of out-and-out fraud or criminal activity. So you've got to be thoughtful about how you manage a stock market as well. But I think you have that kind of debate going on in China now to a greater extent than you did, say, a year or two ago. So that's my summary. Look, my summary is pretty good. So far, so good. There are certainly danger spots and weak spots ahead that have to be navigated through. There's a good Asia team on board, and we're dealing in a different environment now because of the global turmoil. Thank you.
Thanks,
Steve.
Frank. Thank you. Thanks very much. Let's get to discussion here. I should Also note to our very good staff, particularly to Ben, who does everything, that this floor really squeaks. And this is all new. We're in new facilities here, and we're still getting used to them, so we need to fix this. My apologies to those who have to hear it. Frank, let me just start with the first thing about Barack Obama's China policy and challenge you a little bit about you saying that this is rolling out like every other president. When I look back to Bill Clinton, I look back to even President Reagan, whom you knew well. When I think about Jimmy Carter, even you go back to the typical dance that began in China was to be tough with China on trade, human rights, certain kinds of issues. And then they would come to sort of a key point where there was a fork in the road, and the fork in the road was always the U.S. China relationship was more important than disrupting it, and so they went to. This administration clearly took a different tack. When Obama first spoke to Congress in his State of the Union-like address to Congress, he referred to China not in terms of the threats and concerns, but as a superpower in renewable energy. It was remarkable. And you could tell Hillary Clinton, who had tried to advise President Bush not to go to the Olympic Games ceremonies, has, of course, given herself a makeover and taken a much more realist tack with China. So I guess geopolitically, I mean, you could say, well, that's a positive sign for U.S.-China relations. But do you think, knowing China as you do, that this is read as a sign of weakness of the U.S. presidency?
Yeah, we ought to walk through this. Look, I don't fundamentally see Obama's approach to China different than the others, as I define it, which is, look, he doesn't view the China relationship essentially as a way to score domestic political points. He's trying to deal with the issues in front of him as a professional. What he's looking for is regularized, serious, high-level diplomacy. So let's treat this relationship, so to speak, the way we treat other relationships. It might be more important than others, but what we want is a professional, mature discussion where leadership can deal with their issues and resolve them in a professional way. Now, I think that is how all the other presidents have seen it. You are also completely correct that people don't always get to that particular point through a straight line trajectory. And we recall when Governor Reagan was running for president, he was asked a question at one event about, Jimmy Carter has now switched diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. Would you ever think about changing it back? And he said, yeah, absolutely, we should think. He said words like that. He responded positively, we should think about it, or I'd be open, or something like that, which you can imagine how Beijing responded to that. And Congressman George Bush was dispatched to Beijing during the campaign, which is pretty unusual, to say, let me just walk you through what the governor really was saying and what he really meant. And so there was clearly sort of a digression or a faux pas, if you will, and then a course correction. With President Clinton, it was when he came into office. And he came into office, you recall, not too far after Tiananmen, where it was still sort of substantial domestic political concerns in the U.S. about Chinese behavior and human rights and so forth. And he publicly postulated a series of steps that he thought China needed to take if we were going to have proper relations. And I think he might even had a firm or soft deadline of June 30th or something. He said, these are the 4 steps we want to see. And China sort of ignored it. And then Bill Clinton sort of ignored that. And so the relations went on as normal. Look, and Obama never got deeply into any Chinese issue. He personally doesn't have a foreign policy pedigree. And really the only foreign policy issue he got into was essentially a domestic issue, which was Iraq. But I mean, Iraq itself really mattered as a domestic point to say I'm against Bush, and it's also the differentiator with the other Democrats. It said they all voted for the war and I'm against. But it wasn't really a foreign policy campaign or foreign policy presidency. He says, I'm going to get us out of Iraq, and these guys all voted for it. But he did at one point talk about China trade in the campaign. And at another point, when the Olympic boycott came up, he said something. He didn't endorse a boycott, and he didn't say President Bush should not go. But he said something like, if I were president, this would at least be something I would consider. So he sort of tilted symbolically without committing himself, which, not bad. I mean, he's running for president, so.
I neglected to mention that Frank is chairman of Edelman Asia Pacific, and I should have mentioned that. But as chairman of any public relations firm, you probably pay a lot of attention to the scripting of how the White House does things. Sure. And one of the things that I think is most remarkable that I think hasn't been discussed enough is that when John Huntsman, the Republican governor of Utah, was announced to be Obama's pick to be ambassador to China, Barack Obama did this personally in real time with the guy standing with him.
Yeah.
When I just got back from China, I also got back from Japan and was in the UK a couple of days ago. When the ambassadors to Japan, John Roos, and the ambassador to the UK were announced, they were announced on a list with 12 other nations, including the Maldive Islands. So is it incorrect from your experience doing the Politburo watching of the White House that the UK and Japan have been downgraded somewhat, and that the China relationship has been seriously upgraded?
Yeah. First, I think you're wise to look at the stagecraft there. It's not accidental. I would choose to articulate that sort of in only a positive fashion to say my conclusion is that the president is placing personal emphasis on this election and this relationship, and he is empowering John Huntsman away and credentialing him in a way as sort of the personal envoy of the president that other people aren't credentialed. But I don't think it's a move to diss or to denigrate other assignments, but he is certainly...
He's chairman of Edelman.
No, but look, it's not, he didn't... Obama didn't wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I've really had it with the Brits. I'm really tired of these guys, and I'll be damned if I'm going to do it. I mean, so it's not to denigrate somebody else, but it is clearly a very supportive move toward John Huntsman.
Well, thank you, Frank. Let me open the floor. Is that Shelley? We're blind up here, but Shelley?
Thank you very much for an excellent
If you can identify yourself, too.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Shelton Williams, president of the Osgood Center, and I'm going to China on Sunday,
Great.
So I'm taking notes of what I'm going to say.
Great.
from
Well,
you.
I'm back on Saturday, so if you're coming through Hong Kong, I'll see you
I'll
at the
be there
airport.
eventually.
Okay.
But my point is that on the list of trouble spots, you did not put human rights.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we've just had the 20-year anniversary of Tiananmen,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
have hearings on the Hill now about the Uyghurs
Yeah.
and all of that.
Sure.
And is it not a potential trouble spot in your mind?
It is, you know,
Because the
I
Chinese
always,
still listed.
it is, and maybe it should be there, but let me explain it, and Steve referenced it too, so let me explain the way I believe the administration is approaching it. It's sort of the way it's kind of a U.S. government view, and it's somewhat analogous to trade, which is this. Look, the trade situation in China has improved enormously over 30 years. Well, there's certainly problems and issues. And as the saying goes, when there's no trade problems. When you got trade problems. So, but it is the best it's ever been in terms of adhering to norms, international law, WTO membership. That's the good news. The bad news is because the volume is the highest it's ever been, the particular number of incidents of trade problems is also the greatest it's ever been. So you can misread it. But I would say typically bilateral trade takes place, I would say 80 or 90% problem-free, not bad. Human rights has also improved enormously in China over 30 years. I think by any kind of measurement, the way people lead their lives or the latitude they have or personal expression, religious freedom, rights of assembly, rights to travel, any kind of measurement you put out there has been an enormous improvement in China. There are still all sorts of restrictions. There's not freedom of expression as we know it. All of these freedoms are circumscribed to some extent. But the point is, I think most people who follow China say, look, as long as the trend line is positive, which it is, our policies should be to think through ways to feed into that. Right? It doesn't have to be confrontational. It doesn't have to be filled with friction. It should be more of the long lines, very practical. How can we accelerate a natural progress? How can we help this positive path occur? So that doesn't mean we want a public confrontation on human rights. There are certainly going to be personal incidents where we think there's been a miscarriage of justice with an individual or some other particular problem where we really do want to put the spotlight on something. But in general, it's a more systemic view of saying, let's be thoughtful about this. What might happen in China over the next 5 years that would enhance human rights, and how can we accelerate that trend? And I have not had this discussion with people in government, so I can't comment authoritatively, but my perception is that's precisely the approach they're taking.
Can I just put one thing on the table? I just spent 10 days in China, and I have the same view that Frank does. When you look over time, there's no doubt in the sense that the human rights picture, in my view, is gone. The other thing that's very interesting after the various times I've been there is the pervasiveness of internet access everywhere. What really does concern me, though, despite filters which China is engaged in. In fact, I had a discussion with the Vice Minister of the State Council Information Office, and I put on my blog, about YouTube being blocked. And I had just that morning received an email from Senator Lugar's office highlighting an exchange they'd had with Secretary of State Clinton with a YouTube link and not a text. So I couldn't get what I wanted to see because of the YouTube being blocked, and the guy from the State Council says, well, it sounds like we ought to sort of take another look at our policy, and maybe our office should be using YouTube that way, which was actually a very, progressive stand. They haven't moved that direction, But I am worried about this issue, which I hope some of those folks in this room will take up, which is the question of computer manufacturers and putting in a built-in block into the systems. Yeah. And I tend not to subscribe to lots of of the more draconian stuff. But I sort of feel like it would not be inappropriate for American congressmen or senators to introduce legislation at some point to look at the question of, you do that over there, and we won't, allow, so those kinds of systemically blocking things in manufacturing raises the questions of why we're building our own computers and telecom equipment in a country that's using that technology against the kinds of freedoms that come with that, and the responsibilities.
Well, look, I share that concern. That would be a substantial retrogressive move. I mean, what we've seen usually are, steps ahead and then a plateau and a pause and more steps ahead, and there's experimentation about what's tolerable, what's not, what the response of the government is, what's permitted, what's banned, and the boundaries just sort of, as you would expect, creep out. And then we do spend a lot of time at our firm on a commercial basis with Chinese blogs and how to engage and how to discuss, and a lot of content study of the blog. And it is just staggering. So we did one study that came out a few weeks ago. And I read Chinese, but I read it slowly enough that I normally don't surf in Chinese because you're just kind of tedious to sort of read one, where you can read it in English more quickly. So I don't spend a lot of time on the Chinese internet. But one study we did came out, said, look, we just want to look at social sites, single sites, dating sites, on the internet in China. So there is a single site for date for party members. You have to be a party member. You have to log in. So I can't tell you a lot.
Party ID?
I didn't hack into it. I can't tell you what takes place once you log in. But if any party members are here, there's good news for you. You can find somebody. There's the ordinary singles kind of sites, Match.com kind of sites. That's most of the sites. Or just if you're a bus driver in Shanghai and you're looking for a friend, I mean, you can fill out these things and you find somebody who wants to meet you. But look, there are sites that are explicitly for sexual encounters that, as somebody who follows China a lot.
Those are supposed to be banned.
Well, there's one, for the Chinese speakers, it's Zhou Ye de Yo, Peng Yo de Yo, just friends for just one night. So, you have to sort of have to dance around what they're selling here, but it's not that camouflaged, is it? I mean, so, by the way, you don't have to log into that one. You want to find a friend for just one night in China, you can find one, but you can find that on Craigslist too, I guess. So.
Beyond my pay grade. Yes, right here, this gentleman.
I'm Albert Keitel.
We'll wait for Mike.
Albert Keitel. I was manager of the Asia office, the Treasury, for a while. I'm interested in your experience telling us something about the difference between what politicians on both sides of the Pacific say and what they actually do, and the degree to which what they say could spin out of control in relation to where what they do would ideally take them. And you've just mentioned trade friction that's in the paper today about a Buy China. Of course, we've had Buy America. Chinese have been all over us publicly about the dollar. And the exchange rate issue here keeps raising its head, and people consider publicly that China has an export-led growth strategy and that's a reason to bash them. So I wonder how...
Can I just interrupt
what safety
you? Let me just interrupt just to validate your point. When I was in China, the most regular thing I heard from officials was the Made in America global recession.
Exactly. So what is the chance and what can be done about it? And I think foundations like the New America Foundation have a lot to do here with keeping the rhetoric coming out of the politicians for the purposes of pleasing their constituencies under control, or at least some truth serums, while we let this legislation that always appears early in the year fade in the summer.
Sure. Well, I think your remarks were well to heed in that I think we understand when candidates are running for office, they're appealing to different constituency and there's sort of a different logic. I mean, hopefully they're not dissembling. I mean, hopefully they're saying something to live by. But when they're in office, they've got a responsibility to articulate policy they intend to carry out. And by the way, I give the current team high marks. I don't think Obama administration and leadership are fanning flames or making things worse. I think the rhetoric and the tone is perfectly a normal range of diplomatic discourse, so I don't think getting worse. The challenge sometimes comes in the U.S. context in that there are backbenchers and there are multiple voices, and it's sometimes hard for folks overseas, particularly in China perhaps, to process that and to weigh that, because there's always somebody in the U.S. system who's saying something that might be inflammatory, and it can be a challenge if you're 10,000 miles away and it's a different political system to say what does that fellow mean? That seemed very hostile, or it seemed unfair. We don't get. I mean, and I had to live with this when I was in government. But I mean, the central point is he's not in the government. The government has said X, Y, and Z. That's government policy. This is one person's opinion who is in office. He's in public office, but it's one opinion. I think Chinese comments have also been in that range of normal discourse as well. I don't think either side is looking for a quarrel or looking to exacerbate tensions rhetorically. The Chinese side seems more intent to be speaking to its domestic audience, as Steve said. Let's one of our primary messages that we want to communicate in the course of this turmoil is exculpatory. We didn't do this. This was all done to us, and that is a core message of the Chinese. Now, we could debate this intellectually, how accurate or inaccurate that is, but I think you say, look, governments are going to tend to say that, right? And indeed, for the first 90 days of President Obama's presidency, his core central message is, look what happened when I came in the room. I mean, I found this here, which, he more or less did, right? So I mean, it shouldn't surprise us that this is the first point the political leaders want to make, is I didn't do it.
Ambassador, let me push you a little bit further beyond the sort of bilateral side of a country to country. One of the other things that serious policymakers in China understand, and I think also U.S. policymakers understand, is that given the economic weakness in the United States, given the deficit position, given where China is, given the need to recycle dollars, et cetera, I suspect and I predict that we're going to see a massive wave, Japan-like, into the United States of Chinese manufacturing capacity, that a lot of that's been over there is going to come over here by way of investment, purchases, building of new plants and facilities. So to some degree, you'll have Chinese operations that come in and essentially put Americans to work. Yeah. That's what I see coming. It's not often discussed. That, I suspect, is going to be a complicated emotional and political environment. So how do you agree, and what do you think needs to be the responsibilities in that sort of
Let's say this, you're going to see more of it than you've ever seen. Right. Whether it's a lot or a little, it's going to hit new high numbers every single year because it's starting from a very small base. Yeah, and we dealt with a little, by the way, even before this set of issues, it's had a emotional or political undercurrent. I think you're right with Chinese, that sort of might give it an extra dimension that a French investment wouldn't have. The key, and we looked at this a lot when I was at Commerce, the key demarcation is this greenfield investment, or are you acquiring an existing asset? And if it's a greenfield investment, there's more appetite for it, or more business, because you're going into a community that, and Americans, we have entire offices in our state governments and our city governments that are there to promote inward investment, and it's always Mississippi won the Toyota plant, beat out Tennessee, and they're very happy in Tupelo and so forth. I mean, so that in itself, I think, goes over pretty well. If a Chinese company said we're
buying Hummer,
well, that's not greenfield. That's the other example.
Right.
But
that's the opposite.
That's the opposite. Well, but Hummer, I would say, is also a special example because it's Hummer or death, right? I mean, it's Chinese. I mean, yeah. Well, they're out of business. So
I understand that.
Yeah. So,
I was being silly.
No, but it's more. But I'll tell you, I had. I'm from Ohio, a small town about 2 miles from the home of Hoover, vacuum clean Hoover facility, which is no longer there. And they were concerned. This is now about 6 or 7 years. They were very concerned, Hoover management, because they're up for sale, and Whirlpool was competing against Chinese group. It might have been higher. I can't remember. But a Chinese group was competing with Whirlpool to buy. And the local met with the local management, which was very concerned. And these aren't dumb guys; they're serious businessmen. But they're not internationally oriented. And they said, we think we're in real trouble if the Chinese buy us. I mean, we think this is bad news. They're not. It's not going to be a happy relationship. And I said, my hunch is this: if the American firm buys you, you are dead. You are dead. The American firm is going to come in and shoot you all. It is going to close this place down, and they'll do it in 30 minutes. If the Chinese firm comes in, they'll move slowly.
So it's slow death versus
well,
quick.
well, no, but you might even get them to lay off. But the Americans won't be emotional about it or won't be sensitive. They are just going to fire everybody here. And indeed, well, that's what happened. Whirlpool bottom and said, "You're all gone." So I mean, the point is. But by the way, that doesn't mean that there's not a political issue. I think you are going to see incidents in the years ahead where Chinese companies are looking to buy or invest in U.S. companies, and how astute they are will matter a lot on the outcome.
Mike, and then Cuneo.
Yeah.
I'm Mike Olshausen, Contemporary Review. The title of your talk, New Mercantilism versus Responsible
Well,
Stakeholding.
just for the record, I picked that title.
I know, but it's a good title. But it leads to
He protested.
it leads to an even better question. So here we go. Does something like that, which I think many people sort of those categories are broad in the public. These are,
exactly.
Which is the reason you chose the title. If you do you think that it's better to think of the Chinese leadership as divided maybe into factions which tend to espouse one of these two perspectives, or is it perhaps better to think of it as if these were postures that the leadership can adopt in a more labile way? That is to say, to what extent do they polarize along these?
For the audience watching, the title was, I think, Neo-Mercantilism versus Responsible Stewardship.
It's a question about instrumentalities versus polarization.
Thank you.
Great. I don't think it's factions. But you have tendencies. You have impulses. And look, it's a little bit like the United States in that one person can encompass somewhat contradictory tendencies, and depending on the moment or the issue at hand. So we say, look, do lower taxes help our economy and help industries compete? Absolutely. Do we want a more interventionist government to help solve our problems? Well, absolutely. As that poli-sci professor, as Bill Schneider, that fellow on CNN, said, the problem isn't that Americans are 50% on each issue. The problem is Americans are 100% on each issue. You ask them a question, do you want a smaller government, lower taxes? They say, you bet. And they say, by the way, do you want all of our health care plans solved by? Yeah, you bet too. We want it all. So, the point is you've got these impulses. No question in China. They said, you want a modern internationalized economy that competes at world best practices. They say, absolutely, that's our goal. That's where we're trying to go. Well, then why are you adopting national standards that are going to retard this process and sort of segregate you from some international technology developments? Well, we sort of got to, we've got a ministry here and they're sort of unhappy and, we've got to sort of play along. And that's just the way life is sometimes. So we've got domestic political constituencies and rent seekers, and there's all sorts of impediments. But they'd agree philosophically that, open market-driven economies get you the best outcome, but watch out. Not always in certain circumstances, so you've got to compensate for it. I think what I was trying to indicate in my remarks was I think there's just been a shift at the margin away from sort of a market model or a Western-oriented model to say, I think if you'd asked a Chinese intellectual a few years ago, where are you trying to go? What's your model? Where are you trying to go? And I think they'd say, something like the U.S. economy is where we ought to be. And we'll be there. We'll be there in just a few decades. We'll be a modern, internationalized economy. That's where we're going to be. And I think if you asked me that today, we'd say, no, some of your elements are pretty good, but some just aren't. We're going to go our own path.
Frank, one of the things I was in China and asking about this responsible stakeholder speech that Bob Zoellick gave, and I said, how influential or seductive or important was that in your own framing? And they said, we were basically moving in a direction similar, but from their view, what the value of Zoellick's framing was more influential with Americans and how they perceive China and what it's doing, and giving a narrative to do battle with the neoconservative battle in terms of and I was sort of intrigued that they thought it was more important to sort of give us a story on China than to give them a story. Do you agree?
I hadn't heard that. I think I don't know. I hadn't heard that theory. Look, I think it's one of the sort of challenges of our era is the definition of China's international role, this is for China to define, but there's going to be moments and issues on which it impinges on U.S. Aspirations or U.S. as we define our role. So China isn't the only voice in this. It's as you understand foreign policy, it's sort of a collective discussion. So you take back a step from that and say, fine, but what are the ultimate goals and what is the philosophy that underlies that foreign policy goal. We understand China follows a national interest foreign policy, which I think should give us all comfort. I mean, it's rationalist, it is national interest, but I think by Zellick's responsible stakeholder, do you mean long-term or enlightened national interest, or you mean narrow or short-term national interest? And we'd say, the more enlightened the national interest is, I think the better off we all are, and the better off China is. But that evolution can take a while, and what is China's ultimate appetite for that evolution? What I think was good for Bob to sort of articulate that if, as China plays an increasingly important role in the international system, in international bodies and international trade, it has increasing military capacity, the system itself and the fairness of the system and the management of the system becomes important to China. So it is a stakeholder in it, and then it behooves them in some respect to play a leadership role or a management role in that broader process. I think that's got some traction in China, and the question is, over the next decade or two, will that grow?
I was in China worried about them melting Greenland with all of this production, and you said it will flood all the coastal regions. But yes, Kunio?
Kunio Kikuchi from Masaoka and Associates. It's a fad to talk about U.S. and China today in this town. And here is U.S. and there's China and there's nothing in between until, of course, Steve mentioned the magic word for me, Japan. And in fact, if you look at U.S.-China relationship, and when the first year I came to the U.S. in 1960, the enemy number one for United States was China. Far bigger and far more threatening than North Korea ever would be. And yet today it's as if there's nobody else. So the first point is, isn't it dangerous to ignore your long-term partners over so many years just because you have a new girlfriend? That's one. Second is on the trade matters. If any of you have gone to the, let's say, Best Buy or to Ritz Camera and think you bought Chinese, they're all Nikon and Canon, Sony, so forth. The guts of all these Chinese trade surplus very often is Japanese products coming through China. And finally, culture-wise, I went to China last month, and I find that there are a lot of things Japanese that the Chinese are emulating. They're trying to become bureaucratic socialist country the way Japan is. Thank you.
So the question is, isn't Japan really the problem?
That's right. I think that was the question. Yeah. I think you're right that it would be a mistake to be fixated on any country in isolation and not to take a broader view of foreign policy. So I appreciate that point. I think it also make a mistake to look at a trend, or even a positive trend, and simply extrapolate from a trend and say that's the future. We don't know. But I do think it also makes a lot of sense for American policy leadership to think more thoughtfully about China than arguably any other country on the planet, for the reason that U.S. China policy is at a definitional moment or a definitional era. It's not just this year or the Obama presidency. But China has never fully participated in an international political system in its history. It's either been dominant in an imperial system or it's been acted upon during the colonial era. But it's never had a role or a voice in a normal international political system. And this is the first moment where China has that voice. So you say, what is China today? And there have been different Chinas throughout history. There's been China as victim, China as conqueror, China irrelevant. There have been different Chinas throughout history. I would say the moment now is serious China. That China is a serious nation, a serious voice in the international community, someone that we on the American side have to be thoughtful about and take seriously. It doesn't mean that's not a comment on China's relative weight versus other countries. It's not a comment on historic relations with other countries. but it's saying this moment that China is a serious interlocutor and has economic weight and political weight is very unusual. And historically, you would say China was either going through its own domestic political turmoil or was a victim or not part of the international system. So we've never before encountered it. And that, I think, is an argument for saying let's have a serious discussion with a serious nation.
Lots of questions right here.
Norman Bailey, Institute of World Politics. You just said a magic word for me. I wasn't going to ask a question.
What's your hand?
Internal turmoil.
Oh,
Some analysts are saying that because of the movement of workers from the cities back to the countryside, because of growing unemployment and the economic downturn and so on and so forth, that there is the possibility of increased social and political turmoil in China in the, if not immediate, in the near future.
Yeah, and it's also can be a challenge to monitor this. You know, you can look at some elements and say there rise in incidents when you see economic downturn. You know, fine, there's going to be some unrest or protest or whatever, and the numbers have gone up. I understand that. What I don't see is any kind of broad political traction out of that. So I mean, my conclusion is political stability in China is very high. That despite current economic issues. So when there's bad economic news, there can be a sort of a social response or a community response. And you know, you don't really have bankruptcy law in China, and it's unfortunate, and it shows you a weak legal system, if I may say, it kind of has a cruel impact on workers, because what you have when a company is sliding into insolvency, but it's still a going concern, there's a perverse incentive for management to just keep things going until the cash register is empty and not to tell anything to anybody and then just walk away. And if you took a U.S. approach to say, let's chapter this and let's put under court adjudication and let's at least keep production up and keep people employed, what you would think, at least the U.S. or the Western system allows for that, that can't be done in China, unfortunately. And so you get these terrible incidents where the writing's on the wall, this company's going the wrong way, but there's 4 months left of raw materials, so we'll keep things going for 4 months, but we can't say anything to anybody. And then we just leave. And then 200 workers show up the next day, and they're out a month's wages, and there's no boss, and it's a very unhappy situation. So you have these things. But my point is, yeah, that's bad news. That is not a political movement. That is not a protest at Beijing. There's no mechanism for that to turn into political protest. So I give political stability very high marks in China.
Yes, right here, and then back.
Thank you. Robert Kelly, American University. I wanted to get your take on the recent BRICS meeting in Russia, the convening of Brazil, India, Russia, and China. When something like this happens, you always get there's always this kind of remote fear that China is looking to, while playing the game in the Western international paradigm, remove itself from the Western orbit as well. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how concerned should we be about China's continuing, playing the game on the Western side while at the same time trying to cultivate its own campaign for international primacy?
Yeah, I define that a little differently. It's a great question, and it feeds into the enlightened self-interest question. I define a little differently. Look, our only expectation for China should be that China pursues a policy consistent with its national interest. And then U.S. policy should be, how do we engage China to help shape that view of that national interest so it's consistent with our interest? Right? That, to my mind, is a sound foreign policy approach. Meaning, it wouldn't surprise me at all if China's view towards international organizations is, look, we're more or less in favor of them when they serve our interests, right? But we didn't design these. We didn't set them up. We have no emotional or ownership attachment to them. But, if they work, if they're functional or fair or provide some mechanism for us to move ahead, we have no problem with them. But why shouldn't we do what other countries do all the time, which is initiate some arrangement or see what we can do, and why don't we experiment a bit too and have some authorship and some initiative of our own? Who's to say? Are we trapped forever in the sort of post-World War II Bretton Woods determination, or do we have pride of authorship as well? I mean, why not? And so I'm not surprised at all that they've got at least some inducement to do some of this experimentation, and it's not intrinsic. I don't view it as intrinsically adversarial and inimical. Look, I think the BRIC one's not going anywhere. The more interesting arrangement potentially is the SCO, but BRIC is a complete contrivance.
I'm going to cluster just a couple of questions here.
Okay.
Running out of time. These two ladies here, and is Mark? I can't. Yeah, right here. These three.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
Good.
Hi. Ying Wang from China Policy Group. I'm not a party member. I don't need a date.
You can't go to the website?
I can access the website you described.
Okay.
A single policy to our Japanese friend. China might not be a sexy girlfriend, but China didn't sell the treasury bond. Japan and Britain sold. To make my question simple, what's the Obama administration's policy towards Tibet and China? Can U.S. play a role between His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese government? Thank you.
Right there. And let's take this lady here. I think in the white, we are blind up here. Yes, and then right in front.
Is it on?
It's on.
Because of the growing trade deficits, many countries, China's many trading partners, including the U.S., is pushing China to reevaluate its currency. But those countries who are very dependent on China's export will not enjoy the revaluation because the export will be very expensive. I'm concerned about it because I'm from Mongolia, which is a neighbor to China. So, what's the policy of the new administration in pushing China to reevaluate its currency? Thank you.
And right in front here.
Mark Naterno. I'm wondering about your assessment of the effect of U.S. policy and rhetoric about human rights on the improvement of human rights in China over the past years. And also I'm wondering about your prognosis regarding how this China's sphere of influence in the world will evolve in relation to our sphere of influence in the world, how these things are going to evolve.
Great set of questions.
Yep. All essay questions, too. Look, first let me say up front, in case there's a little confusion here, I am not a member of the administration. I'm not a spokesman for the administration, and I don't. I think on a lot of issues like China policy, I think I find myself generally aligned, generally supportive of the administration. But I don't work for the government, and I didn't vote for this current president. So I'll give you my impression. My impression.
So is Ron Paul then?
That's right. My impression is that the approach toward Tibet and currency is about identical as the previous administration, which is there's a view that China's not where it should be on either of those issues and needs to sort of do a better job, but it's not in the top tier of issues in the bilateral relationship. And indeed, we saw, I think, evidence to that on both issues when Treasury Secretary was going through his confirmation hearings and used language taken directly from the Obama presidential campaign on currency. He backed down from that. So the point is that language on currency concern was articulated in the campaign, but upon taking office, it seemed no longer to be as central. So we saw that. Secondly, when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton visited China, she said publicly, you might remember the exact words, but she said words to the effect as she was leading up to her meetings in Beijing that I'm not going to place a major emphasis on human rights, or I'm not going to overstate human rights. So she publicly stated words to the effect of, which isn't to say we changed our policy, but it is certainly a statement of emphasis. So I think there's a fair amount of consistency, U.S. policy, from what I can see between the.
Nancy Pelosi did the same thing.
And Nancy Pelosi had been very forceful on those issues while a backbencher out of power was 100% on climate change, at least in her public statements. You asked a very interesting question on the relationship, if I understood you right, the relationship between the rhetoric on human rights and the impact on human rights. And this is a fascinating question. And my view was always this. If you are an NGO, and there are some terrific NGOs out there, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, there's some really professional, useful NGOs out there on these set of issues. They have a role, and it's a constructive role, to highlight issues, to talk about problems. That's the role. Government has a different role. We have, though they have an ethic of vision, so to speak, to talk about the way the world should operate and our current imperfections, and that's a necessary part of the discussion. We in government, when we're in government, have an ethic of responsibility, meaning I'm going to say or do certain things today, and they are going to either help or not help. So it isn't a question of posturing, it isn't a question of scoring shots, it isn't a question of creating friction or just making people angry. That might make me feel good, it might placate a domestic constituency, but does it actually help somebody in human rights? And the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. My experience in human rights is the more practical you are in sort of a managerial point of view, the more likely you are to get a response. And there's a smallish group that John Cameron, some people here might know, the Dwight Hoff Foundation, Dialogue Foundation. For example, it undertook a sort of a kind of a simple project on the lines of habeas corpus in China, to simply say, look, what we're trying to do is just establish that there are records kept of everybody who's detained, that everybody who's detained is publicly acknowledged as the detainee, and that their relatives are told. So we'd say this is a modest step. It's a management or bureaucratic step. But it would unquestionably improve human rights if this step were taken. At least there's accountability in the system. But what was interesting to me about what John did is he advanced his argument as sort of a managerial point of view, to say, well, regardless of where you're going, regardless of where China's going, what kind of political system, what kind of human rights system it has, it seems to me any government manager wants to have that kind of accountability. You don't want a local police chief or local mayor just to round up 20 people he doesn't like. There's got to be some reporting mechanism, some accountability. It's got to be, information's got to be logged in someplace. And you ought to tell the relative this person's been detained. So he said that was it's a modest step. It has very little to do with human rights writ large. But, that's a very useful step for people that I think is on that broader path for human rights. So those kind of initiatives, I think, can get you some traction in places like China. The final question was on a sphere of influence, and I'm not sure I recall what China's sphere of influence, our sphere of influence. Look, I would prefer to look at foreign policy. I like the idea of interests, that China, as a serious nation, has interests, and there's a hierarchy of them, and we have interest as well. And what foreign policy all is about trying to come up with mechanisms where we can respect China's interests and they respect our interest, and then we find a way of dealing when those interests might overlap or come into conflict. And that's intelligent foreign policy management. I think I'd be adverse to a system or philosophy that said, look, you automatically cede to us dominance in our geographical proximity. We automatically cede to you dominance in your geographical proximity. I think that violates a lot of American norms, and it doesn't necessarily work to China's advantage either.
And just in comment to the last question, one of the dominant narratives that you hear from the Chinese political leadership is they really don't want the optics of the global order to change. And there's frustration with at least U.S. decisions that have brought into doubt around the world America's ability to sort of lead things. And it's frustrating to the Chinese to watch that. But what the question that Chinese leaders are unprepared to deal with is, what if they don't get the option of sitting on the sidelines? They seem to want to be a status quo power. They want to gather real power, resources, oil contracts from here till eternity, et cetera, but they don't want the optics of the global order to change. And I think what's really interesting is how unprepared they seem to me to be able to fill a vacuum and a set of expectations globally. Let me just say, I think the world is counting the United States out on a lot of issues before it should, that the market is overshot, if you will, on reading American power. But nonetheless, they think there's global doubt in the world today about the United States' ability to achieve its objectives. And a lot of people are looking to China to fill that void. And how do you, given your experience in Asia, in Singapore, and China, sort of look at this realm where there's both pride and confidence, but yet this timidity?
Yeah. By the way, I agree with your interpretation too. Look, China is just getting into the game in terms of contributing to broader outcomes of international organizations, and so forth. China is just getting into the game. I mean, I think it could be decades before they're fully sort of conversant and capable of leading and so forth. But look, I think we should welcome the process. I mean, the more they participate in this, then you're moving down that spectrum to enlightened self-interest. And look, North Korea is sort of the immediate test. You can't simply be indifferent if you're China to these developments in North Korea. They could claim indifference on a lot of issues, say that's not, Iran isn't really our department, but North Korea is your department. So they've got to take a role. I think I also agree with you with this sort of view of the United States. I mean, look, we've had a lot of financial turmoil. The shine is definitely off. There's probably a reputational issue and so forth. But we don't have to think that deeply about this sort of school of foreign policy or school of political science that is sort of the American declinist school. And it's been around for decades, if not centuries. That sort of every decade, America's best days are behind it, and every decade, it's that's it. And but we always sort of seem to be around. And I mean, I'm kind of back. I think it was Ben Wattenberg who wrote the book out of the Indispensable Nation. I mean, the country with global reach remains the United States, which doesn't mean we've got all the answers, because I don't think we don't. It doesn't mean we don't want to work with others, because I think you've got to try to work with as many people as you can. But it does mean that for serious issues, the United States has got to be part of the solution. And it's going to be very difficult, for example, to come up with a solution to Iran or a solution to North Korea without the United States being part of that process. And then people say, well, since you're part of this process and you're the dominant part, you lead on this. So I think we're still very much in the game.
Please help me in thanking Ambassador Frank Lavin. Frank, thanks for spending time with us this morning. This was great. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you.